Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon. I am John Haig, the director of the architecture program at Benedictine College, a Catholic liberal arts architecture program founded on sort of the classical tradition of, I say, circa 1990s Notre Dame School of Architecture here. So we're one of the three classical Catholic programs in the country. So happy to be here, happy to bring students up here every year, and especially happy to introduce your next speaker, Thomas Hibbs. He's currently the J. Newton Razor Senior Professor of Philosophy at Baylor University, where he is also Dean Emeritus. Hibbs has published more than 30 scholarly articles and 7 scholarly books, including 3 on the thought of Thomas Aquinas. He has also published 2 books on film and co-authored a book, Soliloquies, with the Japanese-American artist Makoto Fujimura. A new book, Theology of Creation, is set to be published by Notre Dame Press in the De Nicola Center's Catholic Ideas for a Secular World series. He also has a book on justice as solidarity under contract with Word on Fire Publications. Hibbs has published widely in the popular press with more than 100 reviews and discussion articles on film, theater, art, and higher education in a variety of venues, including First Things, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the New Atlantis, the Wall Street Journal, and National Review. He writes regularly for the Dallas Morning News. And the best part, his lectures have been protested by communists in Sicily and nihilists in Boston. Please welcome Thomas Hibbs.
Thanks, John. I assume no protesting communists or nihilists in the audience today, but one can never be sure. The nihilist thing was funny that was when I was teaching at Boston College and had written a book on nihilism, popular culture, and Karen Boland, who was then in the School of Ed there, invited me over. And next to the signs on the BU campus promoting my talk were countersigns by the nihilist group. And then when it came to the talk, they didn't show up, which I think was more in keeping with nihilism than posting the protest sign. So, as one philosophical prophet said in one film, that must be exhausting, for those of you who get that line. Okay, John, thank you for the introduction. Thanks to Carter for the invitation, and to Margaret Cabanas for seeing to every detail for everyone for the entire weekend, including me. In Terrence Malick's film, The Tree of Life, a child asks his mother, "Tell us a story from before we can remember." Children like to hear tales about their birth, or their parents' marriage, or their ancestors. The film itself, which is in the form of a recollection centering on the death of a son, includes the origin story of the entire universe. It probes human questions about suffering, evil, loss, and the presence or absence of God. Early on in the film, one character queries God, "Where were you? What are we to you?" The film inscribes the drama of one family. It's set in the center of the cosmos in Waco, Texas, this film. That one drama in Waco is inscribed within the whole of the created order, something that is surprisingly rare even in explicitly contemporary theological reflections on human life. Christians tend to concentrate almost exclusively on the human elements of the cosmos, perhaps in flight from the theory of evolution, or befuddled by the vastness of the universe. Pascal's line comes to mind, "The silence of these infinite spaces fills me with dread." Malick's film suggests a visual grammar for recovering our sense of our place within the whole. Being moved by its images, its story, its artistry, we can learn or relearn how to see, how to feel, and how to express mysteries having to do with our relations to neighbor, to nature, and to God. I would argue that this is an essential theological task for our time. Without such a relearning, the full teaching of the gospel will not resonate in our souls. This is an ecological task, as Pope Francis identifies it in Laudato Si. At one point he writes, "Human life is grounded in three fundamental and closely intertwined relationships, with God, with our neighbor, and with the earth itself. These three vital relationships have been broken, both outwardly and within us. This rupture is sin. The harmony between the Creator, humanity, and creation as a whole was disrupted by our presuming to take the place of God and refusing to acknowledge our creaturely limitations." Known in the popular press mostly for its affirmation of global warming, Laudato Si is in fact a theologically rich document. The ecological crisis, Francis insists, is but a symptom of a much deeper disorder. As he says, if the present ecological crisis is one small sign of the ethical, cultural, and spiritual crisis of modernity, we cannot presume to heal our relationships with nature and the environment without healing all fundamental human relationships. At the root of this crisis is a mistaken view of human freedom, which Francis, following closely his predecessors Benedict and John Paul, calls radical anthropocentrism. We have, Francis says, quoting Benedict, forgotten that man is not only a freedom which he creates for himself. Man does not create himself. He is spirit and will, but also nature. According to the anthropocentric, or what we might call technocratic paradigm, there is no intrinsic value in lower beings. Diametrically opposed to this view is biocentrism, which sees no special value in human beings. Our dilemma would be somewhat limited, bad enough, but somewhat limited, if it had to do with a tendency just to opt for one of these options. But it's deeper, Francis says, because we vacillate between the two in a constant schizophrenia. We are lost in the cosmos. The radically anthropocentric paradigm sees the entire physical world, including the human body, as raw material to be manipulated to satisfy human desire. Such a model has had a huge impact on our visual culture. In his work on the crisis of the visible, the philosopher Jean-Luc Marion argues that in our culture, images typically operate as consumerist idols. In the guise of idols, objects present themselves to us as he puts it, proportionate to the expectation of desire. That's a really clear line from Jean-Luc Marion. You have to look for those. The way in which consumer goods present themselves to us as satisfying whatever desires or preferences we happen to have at the moment. The idol thus satisfies desires without educating or transforming or even questioning them. The opposite of the idol is the icon. Now, Marion's notion of the idol remains pretty consistent, while his conception of the icon varies from a fairly narrow idea connected with traditional religious iconography to a broader notion that covers painting itself. The icon, he writes, brings the unseen to light and puts the viewer in question. Parallel to this crisis of the visible is a crisis of speech, the breaking down of the connection between word and world. The covenant between signified and signifier is broken, as George Steiner puts it. Seeing and saying are interconnected. To restore one, we must restore the other. Now, it might seem obvious that in order to say something, we would first have to see or know something. But the reverse can be true as well. An expanded vocabulary can help us to see more and better whatever it is that we encounter. Furthermore, if our seeing is distorted by disordered desire, we shall neither see nor name clearly. What we see or fail to see is often deeply influenced by our passions. So we must learn anew how to see, to feel, and to say. The radical anthropocentric paradigm gives a particular inflection to our incapacities in these areas of seeing, feeling, and saying. If we think of the external world, even our own bodies, as raw material, then we may well distort all sorts of things about nature, ourselves, and others. One way to articulate this crisis, which I think Francis comes close to doing in Laudato Si, is to see it as a crisis of homo faber, the human person as maker. In an illuminating commentary on the encyclical, Naomi Oreskes, professor of history of science at Harvard, identifies the misleading paradigm as what she calls technofideism, a blind faith in technology. The problem, as Frances puts it, is that we have lost our ability to direct technology in an ethical way. The technocratic disposition focuses on the human capacity to transform nature, and thus neglects the notion that human persons are fundamentally receptive of an order not of their own devising. By way of reaction against the consequences of the anthropocentric model, biocentrism is tempted to see human intervention in nature as dangerous and evil. I think that it's right to say, and I argue this at greater length in the book that the center is publishing, that the radical anthropocentric paradigm is at home in a certain very prominent strain of Enlightenment progressive rationalism, and biocentrism is at home in certain strains of romanticism, in the reaction against rationalism. Frances highlights the dignity of human persons, the nobility of the human vocation, which involves a participation in God's creative action. He explicitly advocates at one point in the encyclical for what he calls an aesthetic education. The appreciation and practice of the arts of the beautiful fosters the ecological virtues of receptivity, wonder, humility, and gratitude. I would like to suggest in this talk today that the art of Rouault offers precisely such a recovery of the place of human beings within the whole, a way of relearning how to see, feel, and say. One of the striking features of his art is his pairing of words and images, texts and paintings or prints. His art is a pedagogy in seeing, feeling, and saying. I can only give, in the time allotted to me today, an introductory exposition, but I do want to say that one of the reasons that I think his art is so powerful is precisely because it is neither strictly religious nor strictly secular. It mediates between the two in ways that can help all contemporary human beings identify, name, and respond to the disorders and longings of our soul. For us as viewers, submission to a certain type of pedagogy of the image can foster what Simone Weil famously called the habit of attention. She writes, attention consists in suspending thought, leaving it available, empty, and subject to penetration by the object. Our thought must be like a man on a mountain who, looking in front of him, sees without looking at them many forests and plains below him. Thought must remain empty, awaiting, ready to receive the naked truth of the object that will penetrate it. Such conceptions of the source and impact of art cut against an understanding of art as arbitrary self-expression, in which the object of art is an idol for both the artist and the viewer. The reduction of art to market forces of mere self-expression and consumer preference renders the work an idol that gives back to us only what we have already put in it. This is the assessment of the contemporary Japanese-American artist Makoto Fujimura, who, by the way, has done a series of paintings responding to Rouault's paintings, who comments on the way artists, contemporary artists, contribute to the pollution of our culture through self-aggrandizement and a type of embezzlement made in the name of advancing the creative arts. Rouault was painfully attentive to the pollutions of modern culture. I'm going to take you through, not the whole Miserere, it's much too big for us to go through today, but I want to take you through a certain set of images. This is Rouault's great defining work that he worked on over decades. And Miserere, the word itself comes from Psalm 51, right, which is recited every Friday morning as a penitential psalm in the liturgy of the church. I want to begin with a triptych of images, 6 through 8 in the Miserere. This first one begins with a question: are we not all convicts? The next one, look at that face. Are we not all convicts, supposing ourselves kings? And the last, who does not wear a mask? These are connected. Are we not all convicts, sinners, supposing ourselves kings? Who does not wear a mask? The first image bears the imprint of sorrow, followed by a histrionic figure, a mockery of regal lineage, while the last looks like many of Rouault's forlorn clowns. The contrast between the first and second statements, are we not all convicts, supposing ourselves kings, underscores the gap between who we are and how we conceive of ourselves. The third suggests, who does not wear a mask, a deceptive mode of presentation to the external world. It calls to mind the lines from Eliot's Prufrock, there will be time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. But the triptych is as much about self-deception, supposing ourselves kings, as it is about the deception of others. The accent on the wearing of masks underscores our manipulation of images to suit our self-aggrandizing desires. We resist self-knowledge. Because of our lack of self-knowledge and our idolatrous relationship to images, we are not rightly disposed to receive what is given in art. We are neither neutral observers nor ideal viewers. We are prone to the same vices of vanity as viewers that Rouault depicts with unflinching honesty in his art. Hence, the artist must begin by accusing, even offending, his audience. As Susan Mihalchek from Boston College has shown in an essay on Rouault and the aesthetics of shock, Rouault owes much to Baudelaire and his strategy of dédoublement, the goal of which is to astound and decenter the viewer, who would prefer to occupy a comfortable, detached position at a safe distance from the image. To see ourselves truly, we will have to acknowledge our guilt and our seemingly insatiable appetite for self-delusion. Very early in his career, Rouault focuses on certain characters or social types, prostitutes, judges, and clowns. Su Yun Kang is a scholar of Rouault's, written a lot of good stuff on this. They operate as negative icons, Baudelairean icons, undercutting our consumerist libido videndi, the lust of seeing, that leaves viewers at a safe distance from the object under their gaze. These images serve in part to mock our lust, our vanity, and our addiction to the surface veneer of happiness. One is reminded of the Baudelaire line from another poem of Eliot's, The Wasteland, hypocrite lecteur, the reader. But in this case, Rouault is accusing the hypocrite spectator, us as viewers. Rouault was never tempted by models of facile or easy transcendence. In fact, some observers, some of his friends at the time that he was painting these early paintings, have thought him guilty of the opposite vice, that of wallowing in human degradation. Interestingly, the same accusation has been made against another Frenchman who had an enormous influence on Rouault, Blaise Pascal. But Rouault, it seems to me, was a better reader of Pascal than most contemporary readers are. He sees that the key insight of Pascal about the human condition is that it is not characterized merely by wretchedness, but by a paradoxical combination of wretchedness and greatness. And in fact, any judgment of wretchedness presupposes a recognition, however dim and implicit, of some notion of order and greatness. As Pascal writes after an assemblage of all the disorders of the human condition, he says, all of these examples prove his greatness. It is the wretchedness of a dispossessed king. In one of his books, Rouault says this, we are fallen, it is true, but my clowns are really only dispossessed kings. Their laugh is familiar to me. It reaches the realm of a million stifled sobs. The very fact that we see our condition as wretched presupposes that we recognize some other state as proper to and better for us. Hence the lament that we experience in the face of our misery. As one of as a perceptive commentator on Rouault writes, his judges, however monstrous, make us think of real justice. His prostitutes in their disgrace recall both degraded and real love, while his sad, bewildered clowns evoke, by contrast, innocent children at play. Instead of succumbing to vanity, it would be better for us to begin with the humble acknowledgement that we are vagabonds of misfortune. That's where the Miserere begins, with images of Jesus and an ordinary human being. We see Jesus first with his head bowed, with the words, Jesus despised, followed by another image of Christ, who is described here as always flagellated. Immediately after these plates, Rouault gives us an image of an ordinary man accompanied by a child. The text for this plate reads, "Take refuge in your heart, you vagabond of misfortune." Notice the similarity in posture between Christ and the ordinary man. The mirroring of Christ and ordinary human beings is instructive and runs throughout the Miserere series. From Genesis, we know that we have been created in the image and likeness of God. In the incarnation, Christ takes on our image. As suffering servant, Christ takes on the images of the poor, the marginalized, those who wander without hope, in a tragic dislocation from self, others, nature, and God. The Miserere seeks to shock us into recognition, into knowing for the first time or knowing anew that to which we are so prone to become oblivious, namely the significance of the fact that God himself has become a vagabond of misfortune. After a series of images of upper-class characters, I don't have all these in here, bourgeois female characters for whom wealth and prestige give rise to high self-regard, even to the supposition, as he has it in one of the titles, that they have earned a place in heaven. There's a series of images of a condemned man and a lawyer. Eventually, we reach the image of a morgue with piles of skulls surrounding a crucifix, a dark and forbidding image. But the scriptural text here says, "Whoever believes in me, though he die, will have life." Philosophers and theologians have often detected in the human devotion to wealth and social status and prestige a flight from mortality, from the fact of our own impending death. Philosophers have sometimes counseled a therapeutic practice of running toward death, not fleeing it. But Rouault is not affirming a Heideggerian being toward death or a Stoic indifference in the face of death. Death remains an enemy for him, the last one to be destroyed, as Paul tells us. Guided by Rouault's images, we turn ourselves in anxiety and fear and with hesitation toward death, toward our deaths, only to discover that someone is there waiting for us, someone who has embraced desolation and already abandoned himself to the nothingness of death, not out of despair, but out of love. In our vanity, we seek to make ourselves into something and only serve to evacuate our lives of meaning. In his fullness, Christ takes the nothingness of sin upon himself and embraces the nothingness of death in order to communicate the fullness of life. Philosopher William Desmond puts it this way: God is given over to a desecration, not as an insulted warlord requiring blood ransom, but as a servant, revealing God as there in the instance of death itself, not outside, but within this instance, with the most intimate immanence. This immanence is nothing other than the generosity of God, for the other as other, for its good as the gift of life itself. This is the logic of the loving servant who consents to be good by being willing to be as nothing. Christ's emptying of himself, his willingness to take violence into himself without responding with vengeance, his willingness to be, as Rouault puts it in a direct quote from Pascal in one of the images in the Miserere, to be in agony until the end of the world, annihilates nihilism. After a series of images of Christ, including his baptism and crucifixion, we encounter an image of a human character turned toward Christ with the words, "Lord, it is you, I recognize you." For the first time in the entire series of prints, instead of alternating images of Christ and ordinary human beings, Christ appears in the same frame with an ordinary human being. As Stephen Schlosser has noted, Rouault here combines two scriptural passages of appearances of Christ after the resurrection, the confession of the doubting Thomas and the culmination of the journey to Emmaus, when the disciples recognize Christ in the breaking of the bread. In the next plate, the first half of the Miserere, Veronica's veil makes its first appearance. Veronica's veil is perhaps the most important thematic image in the entirety of the Miserere. Again, Schlosser, the image of the veil expresses Rouault's central conviction. The visible world is the outward expression of unchanging invisible realities, the ongoing passion of Christ and the ongoing compassion of Veronica. Before turning to the compassion or mercy of Veronica, we ought to notice how Rouault here plays with the notion of images as images of other images. I spoke at the outset of the crisis of the visible, one variant of which is the suspicion that images only reflect other images, never reaching an original or an exemplar. From this perspective, the lessons of Plato's cave, with its vision of human persons trapped in an underground world, mistaking for real things and supposing they are free when they are not, that view is actually quite optimistic by comparison. Plato presents us with a path out of the cave into a real world, a world ultimately grounded in a transcendent source of illumination. For Plato, we have but to begin by grasping an image as an image, and we can be on the ascent. The modern crisis of the visible is the supposition that there is no exit from images to the real, that each image is but a reflection of another image. For Rouault, the veil of Veronica, whose name means true image, provides, I want to argue, a response to the crisis of the visible. The veil appears numerous times in the Miserere. Sometimes, as in the final image of the first half, the image you're looking at right now, it's an image by itself. Other times, it is an image within an image, as it is depicted here in the De Profundis print from the Miserere. Ponder for a moment the cascade of images here. Rouault, in this print, gives us an image on the wall within an image, and that image is itself an image of the actual veil, which contains an image of Christ, who is himself, as Colossians teaches us, the image of the invisible God. The world that Rouault sees and presents is a world of vanity, a world in which disordered desire, idolatrous seeing, and an inability even to name what is missing in our experience leave us trapped in self-referential images. But what if we could encounter an image that leads not endlessly to other images, but that turns us back on ourselves, offering self-knowledge through an encounter with someone who already knows everything about us and embraces us with mercy. The compassion of Veronica is an image of, or better yet, a participation in the very mercy of God. Bereft of any orientation, human experience threatens to become a house of mirrors, a horrifying carnival of unintelligibility and despair, void of either justice or mercy. Veronica's mercy, embodied in the image of the crucified, acknowledges injustice and its horrifying cost. It also invites us to recognize our disorders, our deformities of seeing, feeling, and saying. Miserere from the penitential Psalm 51 is, of course, the title of the entire work. I think that we should take mercy broadly as encompassing but including more than mere forgiveness. The Latin term misericordia, which is often rendered into English as mercy, indicates, as Aquinas points out, a suffering of the heart over the misfortunes of others. Interestingly, there is an instructive parallel between mercy and envy. Both are rooted in sorrow. But envy mourns another's good fortune, especially good fortune that detracts from my own good fortune or good name. A culture of envy is one rooted in deep but disordered sorrow. Paradoxically, it manifests itself not in mourning, but in pride and wrath. I think if you read Aquinas on envy, you can find a really good analysis of contemporary American culture. For Aquinas, mercy involves not just sympathetic feeling, but also, where possible, an active response to the unfortunate condition of another. Merely feeling badly about another's misfortune does not constitute the virtue. We have to be willing to act to alleviate the suffering. It also requires for Thomas that we see ourselves in the suffering and the destitute. As is his regular practice, Aquinas talks not just about the virtue, but about the vices and dispositions that derail the practice of the virtue. What most undermines mercy is a false sense of security or self-sufficiency. He writes, the proud who get a lot of screen time in Rouault, the proud are without mercy because they despise others and think them wicked, so that they account them as suffering deservedly whatever they suffer. Self-sufficiency is an illusion that inclines us to suppose that we are invulnerable, independent, and without need of mercy. Only through mercy do our feelings, particularly our sorrows, become rightly ordered. The miserere itself is not just about mercy, it's about the manifold miseries, the pervasive sorrows of human life. Only through a right ordering of our sorrows can we begin to see and say who we are and what is our place within the whole. Although almost any of the claims I have made thus far could be contested, one might grant them and still wonder, what has all this to do with the claim I made at the outset? Namely, that what we most need is a recovery of our place within the whole. I want now to turn, in the last few pages, from human to natural ecology. Here I want to turn to Rouault's late landscape paintings. You can see a few of these here. Late in his career, Rouault's use of color intensifies. Gloomy scenes give way to images of vibrant light. The opening image from Rouault's Stella Vespertina, a book of images that he put together, this image right here, another De Profundis, displays a grave with two mourners adorned in black and purple cloaks who appear to be comforting one another. One commentator observes the powerful structural lines, verticals and horizontals crossed by diagonals that create a curiously impressive, timeless atmosphere. The scene of grief here is nonetheless imbued with bright sunshine. There is a kind of serenity even in the midst of loss and grief. The path to transcendence and redemption for Rouault is through suffering and death, not around it. One of the more noteworthy landscapes, this one was one of the first modern paintings to be put in the Vatican Museum, Autumn Nazareth from 1948. Here, the shades of blue, green, and brown of the sky, grass, and trees gently meld into one another to create an ambiance of warm harmony. Near the top of the painting in yellow and orange with a thick black circumference is the sun. In the midst of this natural setting, there's a road leading to some buildings. In the foreground, in an opening among the trees, there are 6 persons, grouped in 3 sets of pairs. The human figures are hardly distinguishable from their surroundings. One of the individuals at almost the center of the painting is shrouded in what appears to be a halo, but the halo is subtle. From the perspective of the contrast that we started with in Laudato Si between anthropocentrism and biocentrism, This landscape is hard to categorize. The way the human presence is diminished in space and size, and in a sense conformed to the natural shapes around it, makes it seem biocentric. Yet the human does not stand over against the natural or exist independently of it. Here it is humbled and harmonized with nature. The painting undercuts any assumption of an antithesis between the human and the natural. But what's more important is that nature itself is transformed, infused with a striking beauty and grace. Some of these landscapes call to mind the contrast Pope Francis draws between disenchanted nature and creation. Nature is usually seen as a system which can be studied, understood, and controlled. Creation can only be understood as a gift from the outstretched hand of the Father of all. Such an art, I would suggest, helps us to restore our sense of our place within the whole. But the notion of a return to an original home is as problematic as certain strange forms of transcendence that we might encounter. Home is not a simple notion. As Matthew Crossman and Miroslav Volk put it in a recent book on Luke's Gospel, the hunger for home is return and advent intertwined. It's memory and imagination, restoration and transformation, creation and consummation. I would say that in these landscapes, this complicated conception of homecoming is what Rouault is trying to communicate. In Autumn Nazareth, we see a new heaven and a new earth, not an escape from, but a transfiguration of this very world. In that vision, nature itself testifies to the beautiful generosity of God. Aquinas' notion of splendor as a mark of the beautiful, which Jacques Maritain himself invokes in his exposition of Rouault's paintings, is relevant here. Maritain writes, what Aquinas calls the splendor of form is the ontological secret that created things bear within them, their spiritual being, their operating mystery. These images invite us to contemplate nature itself as a kind of miracle. Such an experience of beauty has a restorative effect. As Maritain puts it, it has the savor of the terrestrial paradise because it restores for a moment the peace and simultaneous delight of the intellect and the senses. The landscapes which depict the healing and restoration of our relationships to one another and to nature renew our sense of our place within the whole. To be able to see, feel, and articulate these relationships requires that we be formed as individuals and members of communities in a set of practices that restores our sense of what it means to be a creature. Rouault's art fosters this as it fosters the ecological virtues of receptivity, wonder, and gratitude. The final way in which Rouault's art, and especially the late landscapes, provide a kind of restoration of our place within the whole, I would say, is in their eschatological dimension. As I've already noted, in these late landscapes, we see a new heaven and a new earth. In that vision, nature itself testifies, as Veronica's veil does, to the very mercy of God. Here is how Francis puts it beautifully toward the end of Laudato Si. At the end, we will find ourselves face to face with the infinite beauty of God and be able to read with admiration and happiness the mystery of the universe, which with us will share in unending plenitude. Even now we are journeying toward the Sabbath of eternity, the New Jerusalem, towards our common home in heaven. Jesus says, I make all things new. Eternal life will be a shared experience of awe in which each creature, resplendently transfigured, will take its rightful place and have something to give those poor men and women who will have been liberated once and for all. Thank you.
So we would like to take questions. And would you all be fine without a microphone? Could we do this by voice and respond by voice?
We'll stay up here.
Thank you. Yeah, rather than
David?
I don't like to move around. So, we'll just sit here, but kind of watch and raise hands for this.
From right here.
Pardon me? Yes, please.
Tom, I want to ask you about the maritime connections, obviously, important
Yeah.
for the way you're thinking this through. The dark paintings, as opposed to
Yeah.
what Rouault is doing here, these are actually quite a bit different, even from some of the paintings that have more color, but where the black outlines of the figures are much more prominent too. So
Yeah.
there's a lot going on here. But Maritain felt a really strong need to defend Rouault against the charge that some of the paintings, more like the type of the Miserere
Right,
paintings,
but even earlier, the prostitutes in
Yes.
particular.
that they reveled in the destitution, and particularly the representations of Christ, that where the crucifixion was too gory or grisly,
Yeah,
could not actually lift the heart and mind of a true believer. They had too much shock value to do that. And Maritain himself, though he at first defended, later abandoned the Belgian artist Albert Servais. I'm sure you know the story there.
yep,
When he came under attack by figures in the Vatican for exactly the sensuous suffering of, it was actually a set of Stations of the Cross. That was the issue. So, using Autumn Nazareth to defend
Yeah.
the Miserere painting
yeah,
strikes me as something of a Maritain move that I'm very uneasy with, for the reasons that I'm uneasy with the way that Maritain ultimately, though he had first defended Servais, abandoned him
yeah.
when the church abandoned him. So, can you do more to help me get to the sweetness and light of Nazareth, Autumn Nazareth,
So we're-
from the darkness of the crucifixion and of the Veronica?
I'm not sure I can help you
Okay.
get there. We know each other really well,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
Are you asking how Rouault gets from one to the other,
Well,
or?
let me put it more precisely. I would want to challenge your reading of of number 23 of the Veronica painting.
Yeah,
In light of you defend that painting. We can stick with that one. 47th is another
Yeah.
good one. You can defend that one, which could be taken as a despairing painting,
yeah,
in light of what Rouault does in Autumn Nazareth. And I'm not sure that's justified, because I'm not sure that you can retrieve 33 or 47 by
Yeah,
interpreting
okay.
them in light of that
yeah,
later
okay,
painting.
good, I agree with that. So, one point of clarification, and then we can go back to the earlier ones. I was trying to present what I take to be the whole vision of Rouault. And whether that's all internally consistent, I think that would be hard to argue for, as if he had this whole thing worked out in advance when he started his career. That seems completely false to his own statements about how his vision adapted over time. So I was trying to argue that you can find in Rouault an account of our place within the whole that begins with a direct challenge to us through the art to reorient our seeing and our feeling so that we recognize our disorder, especially our disorder in our idolatrous construction of images of ourselves. And having moved through that, I was left with this larger question of the place within the whole. I think the best place to see his full vision of that, of the place of the human within the whole cosmos, is in these late landscapes. So I wasn't trying to use the late landscapes as a way of defending the earlier stuff. I would think those are defensible, both on their own and even more by the larger context in which he's working. So I don't think, I wish I had some of the images of the prostitutes. I don't think that you could look at any of the prostitutes and find them sexually titillating. They're unlike, say, Olympia, other images from the 19th century where you have a fully nude and physically attractive prostitute staring alluringly directly at the viewer. Rouault's images of the prostitutes, they're never looking at the camera. They're always and frequently they're reflected in mirrors, so you get this image of image thing again. And you can't help but feel their sense of their own degradation. What the source of that degradation is not spelled out, and it seems to me it's complex. It's not just a matter of having violated commandments around sexuality. It also has to do with the way in which their flesh and their lives have been commodified in this society of idolatrous seeing and possessing that I think Rouault is dissecting so wonderfully. So that would be how I would analyze those. That is on their own terms. But I think as that moves into the Miserere, Rouault's more directly confronting his viewers in the Miserere and more directly accusing us of not being ideal viewers of what he wants to present.
Yeah.
Could I mention a little bit of background? We'll go to this question here that I found fascinating about Rouault is the fact that he was trained with his father a little bit, as his father was a cabinet maker, but he did spend time learning the art of stained glass.
Right.
So what you're looking at in his style of art, yet another added layer of a window on the image. He also presented with the Dadaists in 1905 in Paris, and among those would be Marcel Duchamp. And if you look at, I think it's helpful to understand Rouault against Duchamp, who in 1917 is going to submit The Fountain, which is the urinal, the famous sort of just mockery of everything about the academy and the mockery of the system. Rouault's at the same time going through his own conversion and reconversion. So you see this kind of suffering work through also World War I. Doesn't affect certain people, but it affects Rouault, and you can tell that through the decades he's reconverting through this art. Could I ask you a question? Because I think everybody likes to mention Terrence Malick at least once this weekend. That in a scene from A Hidden Life where Franz is walking through the church and he meets the painter.
Yeah.
And the painter says, you know, look at these images. I'm painting what they asked me to paint. What's going to happen, though, or what's happening right now in 1930s in Austria, is that this isn't affecting anything.
Right.
And the time is going to come that no one's going to argue what we're doing. The quote is, they won't fight the truth, they'll just ignore it.
Yeah.
I paint their comfortable Christ with a halo over his head. How can I show, though, what I haven't lived? Someday I might have the courage to venture, not yet. Would you say Rouault is that artist who has the courage to venture?
I think so. Yeah, and I think the rest of that film, right, is about an individual who's not necessarily an artist who has the courage to venture, right, the hidden life. So that what Malick ends up presenting is something that confronts us with what the painter in the church says he doesn't yet have the courage to present to his audience. Yeah, and I think that fits Rouault as well.
Okay, question here.
Thanks, wonderful talk, thanks so much, fascinating. I just, it's kind of a bit of an open question, but the idea that there's a kind of crisis, a twofold crisis of seen and sane, just wonder if you have any, if you want to say a little more about that. I mean, and specifically maybe with regard to education today. Do you have particular thoughts? Kind of?
I got a lot of thoughts about that, which have accumulated over the years. I mean, I'm teaching a class that I teach every semester at Baylor, moral philosophy class, which I teach chronologically backward from Nietzsche. I cheat a little bit on the chronology. I end with Aquinas after Aristotle, so we do move forward a little bit. And I'm also teaching a philosophy of art class, and one of the things I say to the students in both of those classes is that at a minimum, one of the things that I hope that they will come away with is an enriched vocabulary. Think of that opening, probably the philosophically richest part of Charles Taylor's Sources of the Self, the opening chapter on the ethics of inarticulacy, right? Just the fact that we have a depleted language for speaking about good and evil, virtue and vice, love and hatred, suffering and death. And that's also what I snuck in there very briefly, right? It's not just that we have to first see something in order to say, but the more expansive our vocabulary is, the more we're going to see in what we encounter. And I think liberal education is not entirely, but largely about expanding that ability to see and to say, and particularly the ability to see more by having a greater stock in your vocabulary and in your imagination of stories that you can draw upon. Yes?
Thank you very much for your talk, which I really enjoyed. I was wondering if you could return to the image of Autumn Nazareth in response to David O'Connor's question. I was thinking that the biblical vignette when he returns to Nazareth and doesn't find a very warm reception there. And it put me in mind of the prologue to the Gospel of John. He came to his own, but his own people received him not. And if you look at the rest of the image here, it actually looks like perhaps a commentary on what you were saying for the rest of the prologue to John. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. So
Yeah.
you see the illuminated faces around him. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The true light which gives light to everyone who's coming into the world. He was in the world was made through him, the world did not know him.
Yeah.
So there's that dynamism of he's right there, but they don't see him. He's illuminated by them, but his light is the life of men. So there's the light in the darkness, there's the failure of the darkness to overcome it, there's the failure of the illumined to even recognize that they're being illumined by him, and so there's that, I wonder if this painting represents a kind of, it's his depiction of the simultaneity of what you were illustrating in the Miserere with the hope of healing, but the
Right.
reality that
Right.
there aren't, here in autumn as winter is coming on, you don't have
Yeah.
it's not the resurrection, it's not the transfiguration.
Well, and one thing I didn't mention about the halo is that color, of course, reflects the color of the sun, right? Not in an overt way. So you see the source that illumines the earth is reflected in the halo of the one who illumines everything. But Rouault presents it here very subtly, right? It's all very easy to miss, as you were suggesting.
Question?
I want to follow specifically on this, that I wasn't paying attention in the Miserere paintings about the source of light and shadows. It seemed in the Veronica's Veil that it looks like the light is coming up toward the Veronica's Veil image on the wall. And, that was my sense of, where is the light source? And in the Autumn Nazareth, that's what really struck me is, where is the light coming from? It looks like it's coming from our side, but then if I'm correct, it seems like there's shadows going in both directions from the people in the foreground. So
Yeah.
what's going on with the light?
And they look like they're going sideways in a way, the
Right.
shadows, right? Yeah. Yeah, I think it's hard to tell exactly where the light source is here, and that's got to be deliberate.
So
Right.
that's what I want.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's the sense of the whole thing is being suffused with a kind of illumination. Yeah, very nice point. Back here. Yeah,
The Miserere, the psalm, ends with a plea that God will rebuild the walls of Zion.
right,
Sort of eschatological,
yes,
rebuilding though, as opposed to going forward. But then it also ends, the very last lines of the Miserere psalm, are that the holocausts would find favor with God.
Right.
The sacrifices would find favor with God. I don't remember from the series, the Miserere, and clearly we have images of Christ crucified, which is the acceptable Holocaust.
Yeah.
Is there any sense in the Miserere plates of the Zion being built? Is there an eschatological arc in that sense in the series?
I don't see it there. I mean, I could go back through, but you have, I wish I had the rest of those images on this. I cut this back so I wasn't going through lots of images that I wasn't going to talk about. The image that it ends with is actually an even more this is the last image right here. It's an even more gruesome image than any of the Veronica images, right? I mean, if you look at the shadows over the left eye in particular here, right? This is close to an image of horror at the very end. By his wounds you are healed. There is, just before that, an image that is the closest of any of the images in the Miserere to what we would call a traditional icon, and it's an image of Mary holding the infant Christ. And there's a sense of Mary's presence. It's got the kind of Mary and Christ make a circle at the center, and there's illumination going out from that. That's the closest you get to a kind of restoration. And with Mary as mother of the church, you could perhaps see hints of it there. But all of the other images are, except for the one I showed in where you've got a kind of tomb, right? The other images are all images in rooms or on battlefields. So I don't see the restoration of Zion anticipated there. Yes, yeah, oh no, absolutely, that, in that sense, yes. I was referring specifically to the Zion part, yep, yes.
Yeah, if I got it right, I remember you saying something about within his work, the path to redemption is through suffering. Is that something that you identify as consistent through his entire body of work, or maybe just a certain point? Or can you talk a little bit about that?
No, it's everywhere. The real striking, Su Yun Kang, whom I mentioned earlier, has a paper that she's just written on the poor in Rouault, which we're putting together for a volume. And Rouault goes so far there as to say, you're not a Christian if you don't become these outcast, completely deprived poor. So it's a very strong sense in Rouault of the path to redemption through suffering. One might even say a Pascalian Jansenist emphasis, because that influence on him is strong, yes. But to be ashamed and not to move toward living as the completely deprived poor is for him to risk renouncing Christ. Yeah, that.
Thanks. I don't have any expertise in either fine arts or literature. All this.
So I know a tough question's coming if I get that preface. That's a Socratic preface.
So, but maybe this is a good time, given what you just said, to ask this question. Insofar as Rouault is an artist or a painter who allows us to see what's very difficult in the poor, or in the prostitute images, or otherwise, without taking away any dignity, and I would suggest adding dignity
Yes.
to his subjects. Is there, and I don't know, is there any, was he at all influenced by Leon Bois, the writer of the time? And I came late here, so maybe you addressed that.
No, he was, yes. And
would you care to?
And they had a difficult friendship in part because Rouault he was one of the ones who was critical of the early paintings, in which Rouault was actually, he thought, attempting to depict what Blois had written about. Yes, so there was a close kinship there.
Is there any, and maybe you addressed this earlier again, I
No,
apologize.
I didn't.
Is there any literature
Yes.
on their
Yeah.
relationship?
Yes, there is. We can talk after.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.